The Galactic Council never expected Earth to retaliate. The vote was already over when they let me into the room. I knew that before I sat down. Sarath, the Vothran head delegate, had stopped making eye contact with me 3 days earlier, and in 8 months of watching him work, I had learned that Sarath only looked away from things he had already decided to feel sorry about. He was tall and gray and slow-moving, and he smelled like a fire burning inside a library, and when he chose not to look at you, the absence of his attention felt like a door being shut in a room you had not realized you were standing in. My name is Yusra Malek. I was 34 years old the morning the Galactic Council legally dismantled Earth's defensive perimeter, and I was the only human in the chamber when it happened. The chamber was the size of a small moon, not an exaggeration. I had measured it once, during a recess in the 43rd procedural session, because I had nothing else to do, and the alternative was sitting with my own thoughts, which had turned corrosive somewhere around month 3. The ceiling arched so far above the floor that real clouds formed near the top. The Vothran delegation had complained in month 2 that humidity near the dome was insufficient for comfortable respiration, and the council's facilities team had simply installed a weather system, 400 square kilometers of marble floor. Delegates from 7 civilizations. 1 human, sitting in a chair 2 sizes too large for human proportions, with a translation device on her collar, and 11 notebooks in her bag. I had been sitting in that chair for 8 months and 6 days. My predecessor, a diplomatic career officer named Colin Page, had lasted 11 months before the isolation hollowed him out, and he requested reassignment. Before Colin, 3 others, none of them making it to a full year. The posting was considered, in quiet corners of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, professionally terminal. You went to the council. You sat in the room. You filed your reports. You smiled at things with too many teeth, or not enough, or the wrong configuration entirely. You ate food your body processed, like wet concrete. You attended 3-day procedural sessions about the standardization of atmospheric maintenance contracts in sectors you had never heard of. And eventually, somewhere between month 8 and month 11, you went home slightly wrong. The way a bone comes back wrong after it heals at an angle nobody caught. I had lasted 8 months and 6 days. I fully intended to outlast Colin. The vote that morning was Resolution 14-7 Keth. The language was standard council bureaucratic text, 17 pages long. The actual content lived in a single subclause in Section 9, Subclause 9.3-B. It read, Sovereign repositioning of shared defensive infrastructure in contested boundary sectors, effective immediately upon ratification. That was it. 17 pages to say, we are removing Earth's defensive perimeter. We are leaving 3 billion kilometers of human space open, unguarded, accessible to any vessel from any species who decides to make use of the absence. We are doing this because the Krethna have requested it as a condition of the Expansion Accord, and the Expansion Accord is worth 40 years of trade stability for the Council's 7 member species, and 40 years of trade stability is worth more to 7 civilizations than the territorial integrity of 1 planet that has been a Council observer for 9 years and has not yet achieved the full membership status that would entitle it to object through formal channels. They called it a repositioning. I had a different word for it. I had been told, politely and twice, by the Council's protocol office, that my different word was not suitable for formal proceedings. I thanked them, and went back to my chair and wrote my different word in Notebook 7, underlined twice, with the date beside it. The vote was 7-1. I had known the count before I walked in. A junior Vothran aide had briefed me 2 days earlier with the expression of someone who finds their own professional role in a situation profoundly uncomfortable and does not know what to do with that discomfort, except to perform their role precisely, and then leave quickly. He read me the projected numbers in a flat voice, and then looked at a point 3 inches above my left shoulder for the rest of the meeting, which was the Vothran equivalent of not making eye contact. So I sat in the Earth liaison chair for 4 hours, while 7 species voted to hand our lunch money to the school bully and call it a budget restructuring, and I performed surprise with the precision I had once reserved for things I actually cared about. Nobody noticed. Nobody in that chamber had ever paid enough attention to a human face to understand the difference between what we felt and what we chose to show. We had that. It was not much, but we had it. The 1 vote against Resolution 14-7 Keth came from the Krell. Nobody noticed that either. The Krell were the 8th species on the council. Nobody discussed them unless pressed. They were old in a way that made the other 7 member species look like they had just stepped off the arrival platform, and they communicated in a manner the council's translation systems had never successfully processed. Their physical delegates did not attend sessions. Their vote was registered through a mechanism the council's technical team had classified as transmission of intent through non-standard medium, which was their careful way of saying, "We do not know how the Krell submit votes, only that the votes arrive and are recorded." The vote against Resolution 14.7 Keth was registered, logged, filed, archived, and completely ignored in every post-session briefing document. One Muir Collective delegate referred to it in her recorded remarks as a processing anomaly consistent with Krell communication variants. I wrote it down. I wrote it in Notebook 11, larger than anything else on the page. I wrote everything down, 11 physical notebooks in 8 months, because I did not trust digital records in a building that belonged to 7 other civilizations with sensors in the walls and atmospheric processing units that could theoretically read the electromagnetic output of a screen. Writing by hand made me feel like something the galaxy had not yet figured out how to read. After the vote, the chamber emptied in the way chambers always empty when people are avoiding the person they have just made a consequential decision about, in groups, efficiently, with procedural busywork to look at instead of the Earth liaison seat. The Muir Collective delegates filed out through the East Passage. The Gen processed out in their sealed atmospheric suits, with the deliberate patience of a species whose lifespan makes hurrying seem philosophically unreasonable. Multiple Vothran subdelegations departed through different exits simultaneously. Sareth was the last to leave. He stopped at the edge of the Earth liaison section and looked at me. Actually looked, with full attention, which he had not done in 3 days. He said in perfect English, with no translation device and no lag, in a voice like gravel poured slowly down a long pipe, "I am sorry for your kind. You will not be, when it is over." He walked away before I could ask what it meant. I sat in the chamber. The lights began their automatic dimming sequence. The council's maintenance schedule had not accounted for a human remaining after sessions concluded, so the room went dark, in the specific way that large and important rooms go dark when they have forgotten someone is still sitting in them. I sat in the half-dark with 11 notebooks and subclause 9.3b SPI on my screen, and Sareth's voice sitting in the air. "I am sorry for your kind." I thought about Colin Page, going home slightly wrong. I thought about Sareth saying sorry in a language he had never admitted knowing, at a moment chosen for when no other delegate could hear him. I thought about the Krell vote. 1 no in a 7-to-1 decision, from the species that communicated through non-standard medium and had never once sent a physical delegate to any session in 3 years of membership. I opened my comm to Earth Command. Signal lag from the station to Earth was 4 minutes each way. I had learned in month 2 to say everything in one transmission. I said, "Resolution passed. 7-to-1. Krell voted no. Note that." Sareth apologized to me in English, privately, after the chamber cleared. He used the phrase, "You will not be, when it is over." I do not know what he was referring to, but I believe he knows something the rest of the council is not discussing in recorded sessions. I need the following: every engineer, physicist, weapons designer, materials scientist, and independent researcher who has submitted a proposal to any Earth government or international research program in the last 20 years and been declined. Every name, every rejected grant application, everyone who was told their idea was not ready, not practical, too theoretical, too ambitious, too far outside the established roadmap, all of them. I stopped. The dark was very complete. Near the ceiling, the weather system had generated a small cloud. It sat above the empty chamber, with the mild indifference of clouds everywhere. Tell them we are not asking for proposals anymore. Tell them the brief has changed. This message is the official reason. I sent the transmission. Then I sat in the dark. The response, when it came back 8 minutes later, was one line. "We already started the outreach 3 weeks ago. We were waiting for the official reason before proceeding further." I put the comm down on the marble floor. 3 weeks ago, someone on Earth had seen this coming 3 weeks before the vote, drawn the same conclusion without needing me to confirm it, and started moving, which meant we were not as slow as the Council's developmental assessments suggested. which meant the council had made a mistake in their calculations about us. Not a political mistake, not a diplomatic oversight. The kind of mistake you only fully understand after it has already become irreversible. I picked up notebook 11, turned to a fresh page, wrote the date. Underneath it, they called it a repositioning. Then, after a moment, we are going to build something they do not have a word for. Outside the observation windows, the stars were completely indifferent to what had just happened in this room. The universe does not take sides. It simply waits to see who is still standing when the noise settles. I intended to still be standing. I closed notebook 11, put it in my bag with the other 10, stood up, and walked out of the chamber in the dark, past the empty seats of 7 species who had already moved on to their next meeting. That was their second mistake. The first had been thinking that sorry was enough. 18 months is not a long time. Everyone kept saying this in the early weeks, when the scale of what needed to happen was still settling into the bones of everyone who had been handed a clipboard and a clearance, and pointed at a prefabricated building on the far side of the lunar arc, in a construction zone that did not appear in any council-accessible database. 18 months is not enough time. We cannot build in 18 months what took other species centuries. We cannot produce something meaningful from people who were told their ideas were not ready. Dr. Emeka Ose had been listening to variations of that argument for most of his professional life. He had stopped finding it convincing a long time ago. He was 51 years old. He had grown up in Accra, in a house where his grandmother kept a framed photograph on the kitchen wall at eye level. Not a family photograph, but a photograph of the first African astronaut, printed on heavy paper and hung where you would see it every morning when you came down for breakfast. She never spoke about it. She never pointed to it or explained it. It was simply there, every morning, proof that the argument had already been answered before you finished making it. Someone had already done the thing. All that remained was continuing. Emeka had 3 advanced degrees, a list of rejected grant applications longer than his published bibliography, 4 years as Earth's scientific observer at the Galactic Council, a title so deliberately understated that it had taken him 6 weeks to understand it was a disguise, and another 2 weeks to appreciate the elegance of the disguise itself. The facility on the lunar far side had been approved by the Council. That was the genuinely beautiful part of the whole arrangement. They had reviewed the construction proposal with the careful, slightly condescending thoroughness the Council applied to all Earth submissions, and their technical review board had determined that humanity's grasp of physics was, in the exact language of the formal assessment, endearingly pre-industrial in its theoretical foundations, while demonstrating promising observational capacity appropriate to species at Earth's developmental stage. They approved the Deep Space Telescope Array with a recommendation to support and encourage observational science as a meaningful developmental milestone consistent with Earth's current emergence trajectory. Emeka kept that assessment in a folder he had labeled Motivation. He opened it sometimes when the work was going slowly, or when a piece of the problem refused to yield, or when he needed to remember exactly how certain they had been. The facility was not a telescope array. It had started as one. The first 6 months of construction were entirely genuine, because they had to be. The Council's inspection protocols were thorough. Teams arrived without notice. Scanning equipment calibrated to detect military applications at the molecular level. So Emeka built a telescope array, a real one, a good one, and published 3 papers from it during the construction period, because the most convincing thing an innocent facility can do is produce actual work. One of the papers was genuinely interesting. A Muir Collective reviewer sent a complimentary note about the methodology. In month 7, he started building the other thing underneath it. Not in secret. This was the part that still surprised him when he thought about it carefully. He had not gathered his 43 team members into a room and issued a classified briefing. He had not distributed a complete schematic. He had simply given each person a problem. Specific, bounded, technically precise, and impossible, in the comfortable sense that the best engineering problems are impossible, meaning difficult in a way that makes genuinely capable people want to solve them. Each problem was a piece. None revealed the whole from where the person holding it was standing. A question about energy containment lattice behavior under sustained directional load. A question about field collapse mathematics at extreme range. A question about coherence maintenance in compressed gravitational fields across interstellar distances. A question about materials behavior at the threshold between standard physics and what happened just past it. 43 separate problems. carefully constructed so that each was solvable independently, and none of them individually had an obvious application that would concern an inspection team. And then, one by one, his team started to see what the pieces added up to. Nina Farouk was 23, from Lahore, arrived on the strength of a master's thesis her committee had described as compelling, but somewhat ambitious in scope, which was academic language for, "This will work, but we are nervous about being associated with it." She had been working on the lattice problem for 4 months, when she stayed late on a Thursday, put the final variable into her model, and sat in front of her screen for a long time, looking at the number the model returned. She did not report it. She did not come to Emeka with questions. She opened a new file, gave it a boring name, and spent the next 2 weeks improving the efficiency of the lattice by 31%. She sent the improvement to Emeka, with a subject line that read, "Updated parameters." Nothing in the body of the email, just the attachment. Patrick Adler was 44, from Seattle, a former defense research applicant who had been told at 31 that his directional energy coherence proposal was theoretically creative but practically irresponsible, which was funding committee language for, "We understand what this does, and we are choosing to call our reluctance an ethical concern." Patrick had spent 13 years doing quieter work, carrying his original idea the way people carry an argument they were never allowed to finish. He sent Emeka one line, no greeting, no context. "I found your other problem," Emeka replied with one word, "Good." Over the following 5 months, 11 more team members arrived at the full picture through their own separate paths. They had not coordinated with each other. They had each solved their individual piece, seen what the solution implied, and made their own quiet decision. None of them raised a concern. None of them requested a formal briefing. They kept working. They sent updated parameters with boring subject lines. They stayed late. The emails kept arriving in Emeka's inbox in the small hours, and he read all of them, and replied to all of them, and added each name to a list in the same physical notebook format Yusra used. The Galactic Council had looked at Earth's research output, its funding gaps, its grant rejection history, its developmental scores, and concluded that humanity was too fractious, too politically divided, too internally argumentative, to coordinate at the level required to produce anything genuinely threatening. The disagreement was real. Earth's record of institutional disagreement was extensive and well documented, but the Council had observed it as a weakness and missed what it actually was. The disagreement was the engine, not the obstacle. 43 people who had each been told, in their own context and their own language and by their own institutions, that their ideas were not ready, did not need to be unified into a single motivated force. They did not need a shared ideology, or a hierarchical command structure, or a rousing speech about the future of humanity. They needed only to be placed near the same problem, with the capability to see it, and they would arrive at the same place from 43 different directions without being asked to. The Council's model of how civilizations built dangerous things required coordination from the top down, a decision made by leadership, communicated through hierarchy, implemented by people who had been told what to build. Earth built differently. Grace Okafor was a structural physicist from Lagos who had decided at 19 that applying to funding committees was a form of asking permission from people less qualified than she was to evaluate the work, and she had not done it since. She solved the targeting problem in her sleep, woke at 3 in the morning, reached for the notepad she kept on the bedside table for exactly this kind of event, and wrote down the solution in the dark. She submitted it to Emeka the following morning under the subject line, "Miscellaneous Refinements." The facility grew, quietly. The telescope array above continued to observe and publish, producing output entirely consistent with what its council-approved proposal said it would produce. In month 14, the inspection team arrived. Standard procedure. The lead inspector was a Moore Collective scientist, senior assessor of pre-emergence technologies. She arrived with 4 colleagues and scanning equipment that could detect military applications at the molecular level. Emeka walked them through the array for 4 hours. He showed them calibration logs, published papers, power consumption records, maintenance documentation, a minor fault in the water recycling unit that had developed in month 11 and which he had documented meticulously, because documented minor faults are the signature of genuine infrastructure. She filed a report rating the installation as compliant and non-threatening. consistent with Earth's current capacity profile and developmental stage assessment. She left. 2 days later, at 0340 lunar time, Emeka stood in the room below that did not appear on any scan. Grace had described it accurately as looking like the inside of a star's bad idea. The equipment filled the space in a way that suggested the space had been designed around what went into it, which was correct. He said one word into the facility comm. "Ready?" Nina, at her station 4 rooms away, said nothing. She engaged the sequence. The first test took 11 seconds from initiation to impact. The target was asteroid KL7782, a dead rock at 4.7 astronomical units. The Council's technical assessment had determined with the confidence of an institution that had assessed many developmental stage species that no Earth technology could achieve meaningful precision at that distance. The crater was larger than Belgium. He measured it twice. The second measurement matched the first. He stood in the room that did not exist on any scan and looked at the number and understood, in the way that scientists understand things when the universe stops behaving like a question and starts behaving like a verdict, that they had not built what he had thought they were building. They had built something better, not marginally. They had solved a problem a generation ahead of where they were supposed to be, and the solution worked at a scale that changed what could be said about Earth. He did not celebrate. His grandmother had not celebrated when things worked either. She had made tea and moved to the next thing. He opened his personal log and typed one word: parameters. Then he closed the log, walked back up to the observation level, and stood at the window for a long time looking at the space where the asteroid had been. He pulled out his notebook and wrote one question. At what point does a civilization stop being pre-emergence? He looked at it, then wrote the answer. When something else notices. 6 months after that night, the Krethna entered the repositioned perimeter. They moved the way they had moved for 4 centuries. Forward, without hesitation, with the specific confidence of a species that has not encountered anything it could not move past. They stopped. Something in the dark looked back at them. The Krethna, who had not stopped for anything in 400 years, retreated. In a council database, filed under compliance records for approved Earth installations, a scan report sat perfectly archived, accurate on the day it was written, and wrong before she had finished writing it. I had been back on the council station for 6 weeks when they finally asked me the question. 6 weeks of what the council called courtesy meetings, which was their language for, something is wrong and we are hoping repeated exposure to your face in a conference room will clarify what before we are forced to admit we do not understand it. 6 weeks of sitting across tables from delegates who had stopped performing boredom and started performing caution. 6 weeks of ceremonial beverages, diplomatic uniforms designed to make humans look pleasantly non-threatening, and the daily practice of watching 7 species attempt to appear confident about something making them deeply uncomfortable. The meeting on the 43rd day was different. All 7 active delegations were present. Not aides, not junior representatives. The delegates themselves. Sarath, hands folded on the table in front of him. The 2-bodied Muir representative. The Gen delegation sealed in their atmospheric suits, which made them look like they had dressed for a different environment, and were too polite to mention it. The Krell seat was empty, as always. I sat in the Earth liaison seat and accepted the Gen ceremonial beverage. Refusing it would be a minor diplomatic insult. Accepting it was correct protocol. Drinking it was a significant physical experience, because Gen ceremonial beverages were formulated for a species whose internal chemistry processed compounds that, in a human body, produced effects beginning with the sensation of hearing visual information and ending approximately 20 minutes later with total cardiovascular stabilization and an immune system that had formed strong opinions about the preceding period. I drank it. I was not going to insult the Gen delegation in this meeting. I spent the first 20 minutes of what was almost certainly the most consequential diplomatic meeting Earth had ever been, party to quietly managing the interior of my own physiology, while maintaining appropriate eye contact with Sarath, and nodding at intervals I hoped corresponded to something meaningful in the conversation. Nobody commented. Sarath began in council formal language. My translation unit rendered it in English with the usual slight delay. He said the council had received communications from Krethna border commanders. He said the Krethna had entered the repositioned perimeter as expected, in accordance with the Expansion Accord's territorial arrangements. He said the Krethna had subsequently stopped. He used the council formal word that my translation unit rendered inadequately as halted. The Vothran word implied involuntary cessation, the kind of stopped that happens when something external intervenes in a forward motion that has been uninterrupted. I said, "Stopped." Sarath said, "Yes." The Muir representative said, from both bodies simultaneously, they sent a scout ahead of the main advance, a single ship. It entered the repositioned sector and transmitted one image before its signal ceased. I said, "What was in the image?" The room went quiet. "Nothing," the Muir representative said. I waited. The image contained no visible object, no installation, no vessel, no energy reading. The Krethna technical team examined it for 6 days before transmitting it to us. Our own team spent 4 additional days on it. We have 17 separate technical assessments. They all agree on what the image shows, which is empty space. Precisely the empty space our own scans of the repositioned sector confirm is present. The sector appears exactly as catalogued. He paused. And yet, Sarath said, the Krethna have not advanced. The Gen delegate, whose suit speakers rendered voice at a frequency just slightly below the most comfortable register for human hearing, they have retreated. Currently 0.2 AU from their entry position. In 4 centuries of documented territorial expansion, the Krethna have not executed a voluntary retreat from any boundary sector for any reason. I thought about this carefully. The Gen delegate continued. Our imaging team reconstructed the final transmission frame from the signal degradation pattern. The scout's last image, taken in the moments before contact was lost, was not of a weapon or installation or vessel. What was it? Empty space. Precisely as catalogued, except that our analysts believe the image was captured because the scout pilot saw something looking back at him. The image was a reflex. The pilot looked at what appeared to be empty space, and the empty space appeared to be looking at the pilot, and the pilot's last act was to document it. The room held that sentence. I picked up the Gen beverage I had set down when my cardiovascular system began expressing its objections, and I took another careful sip, because my hands needed something to do. I had learned in 2 years of sitting in rooms where every other species was watching my face, that the most effective diplomatic instrument a human being carries is the capacity to look as though she is thinking about something slightly different from the thing being discussed while thinking about it, with complete precision. I was thinking about a Mecca, about 43 people on the lunar far side, about a crater larger than Belgium, about a briefing I had received 11 days ago, in language so carefully measured that I had needed 3 readings to understand Emeka was not describing what they had built, but what it had become. Sarath said, "We want to understand what Earth has placed in the repositioned sector." I set the beverage down. I said, "You repositioned our infrastructure." The room waited. We repositioned ours. Nobody spoke. The Gen delegate's suit made a sound like water withdrawing across stone. The 2 bodies of the Moor representative turned to look at each other. Sarath looked at me and did not look away. "What is it?" I said, "It is ours." Not an answer to the question as asked, and we all knew it, and it was also technically the complete and accurate response to the question as asked, because what is it is a question of identity, and the correct answer to a question of identity is ownership. I had spent 2 weeks on that sentence. The Muir representative said, "The Krethna have not halted their advance since the Veth conflict, 412 years ago. The combined response that stopped them then involved 3 species, full council military contribution, and 2 years of coordinated preparation. What Earth has placed in that sector halted them alone. Yes. In 18 months. Yes." The Gen delegate said quietly, "Our developmental assessment placed Earth approximately 60 years from any capability of that kind." I said, "Your assessment used our published research." A pause. "We have other research." The room went very quiet. Then, from the Krell seat in the corner, which was empty in the physical sense, came a sound. Single, brief. My translation unit, calibrated beyond factory settings over 2 years of effort, rendered it in English, as one word. Finally. Nobody acknowledged it. The Council had a long-established institutional response to Krell communication events, which was to not respond, not because the Council did not register them, but because the Council had concluded over 3 years of membership that acknowledging Krell communication events produced outcomes more confusing than ignoring them. I wrote the word in my notebook, large, clearly legible from across the table. Finally, Sarath said, dropping out of formal register entirely, using the same voice he had used in the empty chamber 8 months ago in the dark. "We need to know, Commander Malik, not as a diplomatic procedural matter." "Then what?" "We need to know, because we are afraid." I thought about Colin Page going home slightly wrong. I said, "Tell me what you are afraid of." He said, "Not what you built." "Then what?" "That you built it in 18 months. That we did not see it coming. That our assessments, our scans, our inspection reports, all returned the same conclusion: pre-industrial, pre-emergence, non-threatening. And in 18 months, something in that sector looked at the Krethna, and the Krethna retreated." He paused. "We are afraid because if we miss this, we do not know what else we have missed about you. We have been observing Earth for 9 years. The records say one thing. The sector says something entirely different. We cannot reconcile them." I looked at him for a long time. I said, "Now you know how we felt when you called subclause 9.3 Bashi, a repositioning." Nobody said anything for a very long time. I opened my notebook. I wrote, "They are not afraid of what we built. Then, they are afraid of what that says about us." I closed the notebook. I said, "Then we should talk about what comes next." The ultimatum arrived at 41:14 station time. I was asleep. That felt appropriate. The message was flagged urgent and formal, 3 pages, first 2 of precedent citations and legal architecture, the actual content on page 3. "Dismantle what you built in the repositioned sector. Return to the pre-perimeter defensive configuration, documented in Earth's original Council Observer Status Agreement. Accept Council oversight of all Earth research and development activity, with possible military application, with retrospective review authority covering the past 24 months. Submit all relevant technical documentation to the review board within 30 standard days." Or, the Council would invoke the Veth Protocol. The Veth Protocol had been invoked twice in 3,000 years. Once against a species that no longer existed, once against what had been classified as civilization-threatening environmental aggression. In both cases, the protocol was the last action taken before a final outcome. I read the message 3 times. Then I got dressed, made tea, and opened my comm to Emeka. He picked up before the second signal. I said, "They sent the ultimatum." "I know. Formal notification reached me 6 minutes ago." Level voice. Contained in the way that very deep water is contained by being too large to be disturbed by ordinary things. "The review board will be waiting at 0900 for our response." "I know." M. "Yes." "Is it ready?" A pause. His precise kind. The pause of someone deciding how accurate to be. Define ready. If they invoke the protocol. I need you to understand something first. Tell me. We did not build a weapon. A weapon is an answer to a specific threat. What we built changes the question. It changes what threats are possible. It changes what space means to stand at the edge of. The Krethna did not retreat because we damaged them. They retreated because they encountered something that recalibrated what they understood about what they were approaching. Emeka. "Yes." "Is it ready?" The precise pause. "More than ready." At 0830 I walked into the Level 9 conference room. The 17 review board members had arrived early. I put my notebook on the table. I had been putting that notebook on tables in this building for 2 years, and it had become a visible signal, someone who keeps records, who writes things down, who is watching. The lead procedural officer said, "Earth's response is required in binary format under Veth Protocol procedure, compliance or non-compliance." I said, "I understand. I will provide a binary response. First, several items." He looked at me with the expression of a bureaucrat who has identified a loophole and does not yet know if it holds. I cited 17 precedents, carefully, in the formal language of each one, which I had spent 2 years learning for exactly this. I noted that the Veth Protocol required unanimous agreement from all member species before invocation, and the Krell had not provided formal assent through any documented channel. and their communication modalities had not been reviewed by the legal subgroup before the ultimatum was issued. I noted that Earth had not ratified the specific provision being cited, because the provision had been amended during Earth's observer period, and the amendment had not been resubmitted to Earth when Earth's status changed. I noted that the Krethna had made an additional unilateral retreat of 0.3 AU in the 6 hours preceding this meeting, and that under the terms of the expansion accord, unilateral territorial modification by a treaty party created a legal review obligation that predated and potentially suspended any action under the VETH protocol. All of it in council formal language, all of it from memory, looking at the lead procedural officer the entire time. He was very still. I said, Earth's formal response is as follows. The Council repositioned Earth's infrastructure. Earth built new infrastructure. That is the complete and accurate description of what occurred. We await the Council's next procedural step with interest. I closed the notebook. He said, after a long moment, You studied Council law. I said, I studied everything. A pause. Then, the Council's review process will require time. We ask that Earth refrain from any further activity in the repositioned sector pending completion of that review. I said, Earth will continue to conduct all activities within its sovereign territory that it determines are in the interest of its security. That is not a commitment to refrain. No. I picked up the notebook. I will be available via formal comm channel. Thank you for the meeting. I walked out. Back in my quarters, I sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at the wall for 3 minutes, which was the amount of time required for the sensation in my chest to resolve into something I could work with. Then I opened the comm. Emeka picked up immediately. I said, I think I handled it. I know. I was listening. You were listening. You left the comm open on the notebook. I looked at the notebook. I did not intend to do that. I know, he said. It was a very good speech. I bought time, not resolution. The citations hold the review for weeks. The Krell Ascent issue could run 2 months. That is enough. For what? He paused in his precise way. Then, I received something this morning. Before the ultimatum. It came through on a frequency we have no registered receiver for. It should not have reached us. But it did. What kind of something? Coordinates. I waited. Not in any sector in the Council's charts. The Deep Archive cross-reference puts the location approximately where the Krell home system should be, which the Council's own records list as location undetermined. I looked at the wall. The Trell sent you coordinates. Someone did. When are you thinking of going? We are not going, he said. You are. You read people. You keep records. You sat in a room for 8 months and noticed things that 7 species full diplomatic corps missed. A pause. Whatever is at those coordinates, it is not a technical problem. I sat with that. The Council will notice if I leave the station. Let them notice. Through the window, the station's exterior lights reflected off the hull plating, in a shifting pattern, the rotation cycle designed for a species that processed light differently, making the stars appear to drift in a slow arc. Patient, moving with the quality of things that have been doing something for a very long time. I said, send me the coordinates. And I started packing Notebook 12. The star in the Krell home system was red. Not the comfortable amber red of a star past its confident middle years. The red of something that had been burning long enough to form opinions. A color that sat at the outer edge of the comfortable visible spectrum and made the back of your eyes feel like they were receiving information they had not requested. My name is Yusra Malik, day 847. I had been in the Krell system for 4 days when I stopped registering the color of the star, which was either adaptation or something the Krell architecture was doing to my perception. I was not going to resolve that by asking, because asking was not the mode of communication available to me here. I was the first non-Trell to enter the Krell home system in the entire recorded span of Council history. I wrote that sentence in my field journal, on the same page as a note about the caloric content of the gray-tasting substitute beverage the Krell had provided, in place of the coffee I had run out of 2 days ago. 2 entries below a reminder to check the shuttle's atmospheric recycler before departure. I had been keeping consistent daily records for 2 years. I was not going to let history interrupt the format. My arrival had not been preceded by communication. I had flown the shuttle to the coordinates Emeka had sent, at the edge of a system that appeared in no chart, and 3 objects had come to meet me. The Council's vessel catalog would have called them ships, for lack of a better term, but they moved in a way that the word ship does not imply, occupying a new position as though the previous position had simply ceased to be relevant, without any visible transit between. They guided me inward without words. The guidance felt like a hand on a shoulder that was steering rather than restraining. I was grateful, in a practical way, for the distinction. The surface of the Krell homeworld was a material my instruments could not identify, not because my instruments were insufficient, though they were insufficient. The material responded to every scan by returning the scan's own signal back to its source unchanged. My instruments cataloged this as reflective at all frequencies. I wrote in the journal that the ground was being rude. The Krell did not show me their world. They showed me what was beneath it. The descent took 20 minutes in something that was not an elevator, being more accurately described as a change of position that occurred inside a space whose dimensions altered during the process, producing sustained and articulate objections from my inner ear. At the end of it there was a room. The room had been built to communicate, not built to function as a room, built the way a sentence is built, to carry meaning from one point to another. The walls were arranged at angles that changed depending on where you stood. From the entrance, the space appeared to have conventional architecture. As you moved inward, it revised its apparent dimensions, larger, more complex. Eventually something that did not follow the rules about enclosed spaces that I had brought with me from a planet where those rules had always held. I understood, standing inside it, what Emeka had meant when he said this was not a technical problem. You could not scan this. You could not file a report about it in language that would give someone who had not walked through it any real idea of what it contained. The room showed you things by changing what was possible to see from where you were standing, and the only way to receive what it was showing was to keep moving forward. I walked through it. The first thing the room showed me, the Krethna were not expanding. What the Council had catalogued as 4 centuries of relentless territorial expansion looked, from the angle this room made available, like something else entirely. The Krethna had been moving continuously, and with great urgency for 400 years. But urgency and ambition are not the same thing. Ambition moves toward something. Urgency moves because the alternative is not moving. The Krethna were running. The room showed me what they were running from. I am going to describe this carefully, because the way a thing is described is how it enters the minds of people who were not there, and I want this entered correctly. What the Krell showed me was not a species, not an empire, not a fleet, not a force in any of the ways those words carry meaning. The Krell do not have a name for it in any language they have shared with me, because naming is a way of making something containable, and what I saw in that room was not a thing that had ever been contained by any name or boundary or defensive measure in the history of any civilization that had been in its path. In human language, this is the closest I can come. There is something in the space beyond the boundary of what the Council has charted, something that exists in the gap between what is mapped and what remains unmapped, something that moves through this galaxy the way a fire moves through a field, not because it intends what fire does to fields, but because for it, moving and affecting and consuming are not separate activities. They are the same activity. It does not distinguish between them any more than a fire distinguishes between spreading and existing. The Krethna encountered it 400 years ago, on the far edge of what was then their territory. They have been moving in the opposite direction ever since. The Council's territory, all 7 species, all the charted sectors, all the trade routes and defensive perimeters and expansion accords and procedural review boards and courtesy meetings and ceremonial beverages, sits in the direction the Krethna have been running toward. The Krell have known this for 200 years. They voted no in the Council chamber, the only no in a 7-to-1 vote, because they understood something that could not be communicated to the other 7 species from the position those species occupied. You cannot appease what is coming. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot establish a perimeter it will acknowledge. You cannot make an accord with it. The only thing that changes what it does is becoming something it decides not to approach. And what it decides not to approach is not determined by military force in the conventional sense. It is determined by something more fundamental, by what kind of thing you are when you turn around and face it. The Council had looked at Earth for 9 years and seen a developmental stage species. Pre-industrial in its theoretical foundations, pre-emergence on the standard trajectory, non-threatening, endearing in its efforts. The Krell had looked at Earth and seen something different. Not something already powerful, not something fully formed. Something specific. A species that had been told what it could not do, by its own institutions and by the galaxy's governing body alike, and had responded by going away and doing it in a room that did not appear on any scan, in 18 months, with 43 people who had each separately been told their ideas were not ready, and who had built the thing anyway, without needing to be unified into a shared purpose, because the purpose had arrived at each of them independently. The Krell had voted no, because they had been waiting for 200 years for a species that would stop, a species that would turn around, a species that would decide, in the particular quiet way that the most important decisions are made, that running was a slow version of the same ending. I walked through the entire room. I walked out of it. I went back up through the non-elevator to the surface, and the 3 not-quite ships met me and guided me back to the shuttle without being asked. And I sat in the pilot's seat in the red light of the wrong-colored star, and did not start the engine for a long time. I had run out of coffee 2 days ago. The gray substitute the Krell had provided tasted like what gray would taste like if someone had put significant effort into making it drinkable, and achieved a partial and unconvincing success. I opened my journal. Day 847. I wrote, "Turns out we were not the nightmare that arrived." I looked at it for a while. Then I wrote, "We were just the alarm clock." I closed the journal. Sat with that sentence. Let it settle. Then I opened my comm to Emeka. The signal would route through channels that should not have worked from this location. But the Krell had apparently decided that communication between me and Emeka was now something that would function, regardless of what the physics recommended. He answered. I said, "We are going to need a bigger array." He said, "How much bigger?" "The kind that changes what we are, not just as a defensive measure, what we are fundamentally." A pause. Not just Earth. Not just Earth. The silence that followed held something too large to reduce to words. We let it sit. I thought about the vote. 7-1. Subclause 9.3-P. The word repositioning, used in formal council language to describe what they had done to us, and the way I had used it back at them with 17 officials watching my face for a reaction they could classify. I thought about 43 people staying late on Thursdays, sending emails with boring subject lines, building something in a room that did not exist on any scan, in 18 months, because they had all separately been told their ideas were not ready, and had all separately decided that was someone else's problem to hold. I thought about a crater larger than Belgium and a senior assessor of pre-emergence technologies, and an assessment document that used the word pre-industrial 17 times in 17 pages, once per page, with the consistency of a conclusion written before the assessment began. I thought about the Krell vote, the only no, 200 years of waiting for someone to turn around. I thought about Sareth in the empty chamber in the dark, saying sorry in English, at a moment chosen for when no other delegate could hear him. "You will not be, when it is over." He had not been saying, "You will not be sorry." He had been saying, "When it is over, you will not be in a position where sorry applies to you." He had known, not what we would build, but what we were. What kind of thing we were, at the level that mattered for what was coming. I started the engine. The shuttle turned away from the red star, toward the edge of the Krell system, toward the long route back to the council station, and the procedural review board, and everything waiting to be handled there. Behind me, the 3 not-quite ships were no longer where they had been, the Krell equivalent of a door left open. Emeka said through the comm, "How long do we have?" I said, "Enough. That is not a number. No. Yusra. Yes. Are you all right?" I thought about the room. What the room had shown me. The weight of what I was now carrying in Notebook 12. I said, "I am better than I was before I went in." That is not an answer. It is the useful version of one. A pause. Then, come back. We have work to do. I flew. I flew through the space of the Krell system, out past the edge of it, into the space between systems that the Council's charts listed, with the confidence of institutions that believe their documentation is comprehensive. I thought about what the room had shown me, What came next? Whether the thing coming from the direction no chart reached had ever slowed for anything. In the uncharted dark beyond the last documented Krethna position, something very old continued its long movement through the galaxy. It moved through space the way space accommodates things that have never encountered a reason to change their nature. It had been doing this for longer than most of the civilizations in the Council had existed. Longer than the Krell, longer than the stars the Council used as navigational anchors had been burning in their current configurations. Then it heard something. Two humans, talking quietly across a distance the signal should not have bridged, discussing how large the array would need to be, planning in the specific way people plan when the question is not whether but only how. Something very old turned its attention in the direction of the sound, and for the first time in a history measured in stellar lifespans, it slowed. Not because something had stopped it, nothing had ever stopped it, because it had encountered something it did not have a category for. A species that had been stripped of its perimeter and built a new one in 18 months in a room that did not appear on any scan. A species that kept 12 notebooks and cited procedural law from memory and drank ceremonial beverages that disagreed with its biology without declining them. A species that had been told, repeatedly and by institutions both domestic and galactic, what it was not yet capable of, and had treated the statement as a starting point rather than a conclusion. A species that did not run. The red star in the Krell system continued its long, opinionated burn. The stars everywhere continued what they had always been doing. Somewhere between where Yusra Malik was flying and everything that was still coming, Earth kept building. Something that had never slowed kept slowing, which was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of the only question that had ever mattered. Whether, when it arrived at the edge of what Earth had built, it would find something it could move past, or something that had figured out how to be the kind of thing you did not move past. Yusra Malik, day 847, flying back through the dark, with 12 notebooks and cold gray tea, and a comm line to a man already drawing plans for what came next, thought she knew which one it was going to find. She had been right about most things so far. She opened Notebook 12 to a fresh page. She started writing.